In the first episode, we looked at the idea of law and the debate among philosophers, dreamers, and anarchists about whether law is necessary. In the second episode, we examined the imperfect relationship between law and morality, focusing in on the Hart-Devlin debates of the late 50s and 60s. This time, in this episode, we begin a two-part examination of law and force. It's two parts because it actually turned into a bigger topic than I thought. And it actually breaks down into two sections. One, what is authority or legitimacy? Legitimacy to make laws and expect them to be obeyed. And in episode 4, what is the relationship between law and coercion? So first of all, let's look at legitimacy or lawful authority. I'll be focusing in on the work of early 20th century German sociologist Max Weber. The dichotomy between authority and coercion, that they are two different things, appears to be instinctual in man. To the tyrant intent on enforcing his will, or to the citizen who finds himself in the crosshairs of the law, force is an iron tie between the ruler or rulership and the subject. This was understood from the dawn of history, from the dawn of civilization. We can see this even in early Mesopotamian mythology. When Anu, the Mesopotamian sky god, and a member of the triad of deities completed by Enlil and Ea, also called, I think, Enki, ruled the world. Like most sky gods, Anu, although theoretically the highest god, played only a small role in the mythology, hymns, and cults of Mesopotamia. He was the immovable mover. He was the father, not only of all the gods, but also of evil spirits and demons. Most prominently, the demoness Lamashtu, who preyed on infants. Anu was also the god of kings and of the yearly calendar. He was typically depicted in a headdress with horns, a sign of strength. But Anu, along with Enlil, the god of the storm, were singled out for special reverence. To the Mesopotamian, a crucial distinction emerged over time between the role of these two principal deities. Anu, the sky god, issued decrees which commanded obedience by the very fact such pronouncements emanated from his supreme divinity. Obedience from his subjects was to be categorical and unquestionable. Anu was the symbol of authority in the cosmic order. But what of those who defied the undefiable, who questioned the unquestionable? We humans have always had among us those who do both and put themselves afoul of authority. From Orestes to the Canadian truckers. And to defy authority is a dangerous thing. Anu in the Mesopotamian tradition did not enforce or police his own laws. For this, the gods turned to Enlil and the power of the storm. The storm was compulsion, by which the recalcitrant were chastened. To defy authority is to sow the wind, and thus reap the whirlwind. It was the storm that restored order. As Dennis Lloyd has written, the myths of Anu and Enlil reveal the deeply felt human need for order and the concomitant belief that such order, whether on a cosmic or a terrestrial level, demands the combination of two essential elements, authority and coercion, without which there can be no organized society. By contrast, we see in the postmodernist deconstruction of reality the entirely novel notion that authority and coercion can be decoupled, or that coercion can be abandoned altogether. Or perhaps a more accurate description of modern anarchy is that laws are permitted to appear to be one thing, but to act in entirely unexpected ways. For example, in the postmodernist West, laws may be applied strictly and even loosely depending on the circumstances, to ensnare the enemies of the state, while the same laws may be ignored or gutted when the subject is a friend of the regime. Such arbitrariness is understood in modern society to be in the interests of a higher order of social justice, with anarchy and tyranny cloaked under the veneer of equity, discretion, and compassion. By contrast, the ancients saw nothing good coming from such uncertainty and chaos, or from the inconsistent application of laws. They saw nothing bad in taking those who violated the law, friend or foe, even son or daughter, and tossing them off a cliff or into a bog or a water-filled cavern. They saw that there can be no organized society without these dual forces, authority and coercion, which makes possible the functioning of the universe and of a social order on earth. Mesopotamians saw their human society below as a reflection of their cosmology above. Meanwhile, in the Greek and Hebrew worlds, we witness similar actors at play, like Zeus tossing his thunderbolts, or the God of Abraham sending his 3 angels to destroy by nuclear storm the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. All right then, first of all, let's try to define legitimate authority. What is it? Does a bank robber have authority if the bank employees and customers obey his every instruction? He has power, but no one would say he has legitimate authority. Likewise, in this scene from the movie Cromwell, actor Alec Guinness as Charles I, on trial for his life in Parliament, tells his judges exactly what he thinks of its authority.
You have heard the charges against you. The court expects an answer.
First, I would know by what authority, I mean lawful authority, I am brought here and carried from place to place, and I know not what, and by what authority you presume to sit in judgment on me. Remember, I am your lawful king. Think well upon it. I have a trust committed to me by God, by old and lawful descent. Therefore, let me know by what authority I am brought here, and I shall answer.
It is not for the prisoner to question the court.
I am no ordinary prisoner, sir.
An answer, sir. The court demands an answer.
Then I refuse an answer.
Sir, you are before a court of justice.
Well, sir, I see that I am before a power.
And power and authority are not the same thing. On the other hand, authority is not lessened by the fact the loser in a court case is reluctant to hand over the judgment to the winner. No one doubts a properly constituted court has legitimate authority to render judgment, even if a party thinks the decision a bad one. What is entailed in the notion of legitimate authority is that some person is entitled to require the obedience of others, regardless of whether they like it or not. Authority can be in a person, like a monarch, but it can also be in a collective human organization, like Parliament, or even an oligarchy in various forms. The key is that the subject accepts the existence of a legitimate subordination. He may decide to defy the law, flee from justice, hide his loot, but he never doubts the legitimacy of his master. What then is the source of this legitimacy? One source is that the master possesses a moral authority over the subject. We looked at this in episode 2. Legitimate subordination exists alongside a moral obligation to obey legitimate authority. But we have already seen law and morality, although they do sometimes occupy the same space, many times they do not and are separable and distinguishable. But there has never been a ruling class that didn't base its authority to a significant degree on a claim to a moral right to rule. Conversely, no rebellion against authority has ever attempted the overthrow of a government without claiming the ruler's title illegitimate, that the election was a fraud, or that the king is in fact a usurper, and thus seeking in advance to divest the rulers of the legal or moral right to be obeyed. Such claims were common in the 16th and 17th centuries, when government was regarded as established by a social contract. A fundamental breach of the contract released the subjects of the duty to obey, which could cost the king, as in the case of Charles I, his head. We see this today in the notions of fraudulent elections, or in claims, especially on the left, that certain beliefs make a person unqualified to be heard, or unqualified to hold office because the person doesn't believe in the current thing, or holds traditional views of society, or holds revisionist views of history. Any understanding of law and legitimate authority begins with the groundbreaking work of Max Weber. Born in 1864, he died in 1920. Weber was a German sociologist, historian, jurist, and political economist, regarded by many as among the most important theorists on the development of modern Western society. Although Weber didn't see himself as a sociologist, he is considered a father of that discipline. Weber completed his academic training in law and would have served out his practice as legal counsel to the Bremen Chamber of Commerce had his life not taken another turn, first into teaching law, and then into teaching political economy, and then into the creation of what he called his own sociology. One of Weber's key contributions was to analyze how authority establishes itself in human society. What he identified were three types of legitimate rule. In German, die drei reinen Typen der legitimen Herrschaft. His three types of legitimate rule are legal or rational or bureaucratic authority, traditional authority, and charismatic authority. The German word Herrschaft, is a critical term in the analysis and has no easy English translation. Yet understanding the German word Herrschaft is at the heart of understanding Weber's analysis of political legitimacy. The word rule or ruling seems to be a favored translation of Herrschaft these days, although we can also use the English authority, that's commonly used in law schools, and Herrschaft can also be translated as dominion or domination. According to Weber, beliefs in the legitimacy of a political system go beyond philosophy and directly contribute to the state system of stability and authority. All rulers have an explanation for their superiority. Weber's categories of legitimation strategies, which he calls pure types, are used to justify the right of rulers to rule. Legal, or rational, or sometimes called bureaucratic authority, is based on a system of rules applied administratively and judicially in accordance with known principles. The persons who administer those rules are appointed or elected by legal procedures. Superiors are also subject to rules that limit their powers, separate their private lives from official duties, and require written documentation. Weber saw bureaucratic order as tied to the development of capitalism and the Protestant work ethic. Weber considered legal, rational authority absolutely necessary in modern Western societies due to their complexity. Next, traditional authority. This is based on a system in which authority is legitimate because, in quotes, it has always existed, close quotes. People in power usually enjoy it because they have inherited it. Officials consist either of personal retainers in a patrimonial regime or of personal loyal allies, such as vassals or tributary lords in a feudal regime. Their prerogatives are usually similar to those of the ruler above them. just reduced in scale. And they too are often selected based on inheritance. Traditional authority relies on what has always been, the everyday routine as a norm of conduct. And third, charismatic authority. This is based on the charisma of the leader, who shows that he possesses the right to lead by virtue of mysterious or magical powers, prophecies, his own heroism, and similar demonstrations of unique qualities. He appears to observers to be guided by a star. Charismatic authority relies on the acceptance of the extraordinary and exceptional power of the leader. His followers respect his right to lead because of his charisma, not because of any tradition or legal rules. Officials consist of those who have shown personal devotion to the ruler, and of those who possess their own charisma. The word charismatic is formed from the Greek word charisma. The Greek word charisma means favor or gift. It comes from the verb charizazai, to favor, which in turn comes from the noun charis, meaning grace. In the case of the charismatic ruler, which Weber saw as a real person, this grace confers the aura of legitimacy. It is a bridge over a canyon which this leader can pass even without legal or traditional support. Until the 20th century, such leaders were mostly military conquerors like Alexander the Great, Caesar, or Napoleon. The charismatic leaders of the 20th and 21st century derived their grace, according to Weber, through their oratory or achievement, which we can see was projected through mass media like radio, propaganda films, movies, and later television and the internet, as well as by the momentum of the great managerial and technocratic movements that now dominate the world. Charismatic authority does not necessarily die with the leader. Often it passes to his successors, albeit in an attenuated form. We see this in the founding of a new monarchy or a new religion, with early Christianity being the classic model. But eventually the charisma becomes institutionalized, and charismatic rule passes into a form of traditional domination. As for traditional authority, it is a complex network of personal and institutional elements. These can gradually merge into a less organic and more overt and developed form Weber called legal authority or legal domination. The use of the word legal here can be confusing, which is why I also substitute legal authority or domination for rational or bureaucratic domination. The reason calling the type one legal authority is confusing is it suggests only legal authority has laws, and that's not correct. Traditional and charismatic forms of authority also have laws. For example, Emperor Justinian codified Roman law, which had existed in a form similar to early English common law as a series of rules and principles arising from actual cases and the writings of early jurists. But Justinian's regime was still a cross between a charismatic and traditional regime, in which what the emperor willed was law. It's important to note Weber was not engaged in historical analysis, but in describing ideal types. As Lloyd writes, such types are not ideal in any moral or Platonic sense, but are simplifications which provide an analytical structure within which sociological research may be conducted. The analysis is therefore typological, not developmental, for in Weber's view, sociology is only concerned with general tendencies. Weber fully acknowledged that the ideal types do not occur in history as such, but in combinations of varying degrees of complexity. The bureaucratic, traditional, and charismatic types of authority are not part of a fixed cyclical progression a la Spengler. Weber and Spengler were colorful contemporaries who shared a, and I quote, flair for encyclopedic scholarship, a fascination for world history, an abiding interest in the distinctive nature of Western civilization, and a passion for realpolitik, close quotes, but came to very different conclusions as to the fate of the West. Weber didn't see the inevitable collapse of capitalism, but did anticipate the dark, spiritless, soulless monotony faced by the individual in the tentacles of the modern technocratic and bureaucratic state, in a permanent state of ongoing technological refinement and rationalization. Different societies can follow a different trajectory. In the West, you could argue we passed from charismatic god kings to traditional aristocratic feudal societies, to the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, into a rationalistic, science-adoring, bureaucratic type of society. But you could just as well, on the same facts, argue that we actually passed from the traditional to the charismatic order with the dramatic rise of, say, Napoleon Bonaparte, and then from him into the bureaucratic state. There is also the mixing of types. For example, Mustache Man is understood as a charismatic leader, but the National Socialist system was seen by James Burnham in his Managerial Revolution, which he wrote in 1940 or 41, as one of the three great bureaucratic managerial technocracies of the mid-20th century, which evolved independently of any one great man. So, it's simplistic to think Germany in 1933 fell suddenly under a purely charismatic form of authority, even for a short time. It may also be possible that the bureaucratic system and the disenchantment it creates inevitably sets the stage for a purely charismatic ruler, for the arrival of the great man, one of the populist delusions, in reaction to the despair engendered by a now decadent, declining, failing bureaucratic system. And indeed, many still hope for the rise of the great man, although it may turn out that the bureaucratic state is much more adaptable and anti-fragile to allow this to happen. The bureaucratic state can, in fact, change and adapt to stop this from happening. Now let's get back to that key concept, Herrschaft. In Max Weber's Economy and Society, edited and translated by Keith Tribe, we have this explanation of Herrschaft. This is the central term in Weber's vocabulary, translated here as rule or rulership. It designates the manner in which social, economic, and political orders are characterized by a governing hierarchy in which decisions are made and executed by a ruling person or group of persons. It is, of course, related to Macht, the means used to exert rule, which, however, can be unproblematically translated as power. Where Weber wished to put the emphasis on coercion, he had other terms: Gewalt, oktroyieren, degrees of force that flow through the basic relationship of Herrschaft. Coupled with Macht, domination is a possibility. But this shows that to use domination as a translation for Herrschaft runs together two ideas that Weber strove to keep separate. The technocratic managerial state may be seen as revolutionary, as a product of dramatic changes in the 20th century, or a kind of coup, like the New Deal, National Socialism, or Soviet Russia under Stalin. But Weber could see many of its aspects inherent long before it emerged, and even as inevitable, as an essential part of capitalism's development, of its ongoing need for rationalization and modernization, with the Protestant work ethic as its founding spirit and sustaining force. Modernization, as Weber saw it, was a relentless rationalization of all aspects of society. Weber assumes an endless, rational means-end process inherent in capitalism. But is it necessarily rational? Or can it take on elements of the traditional or charismatic with the irrational as its foundation, preferring the theological to the empirical as its form of order? If the bureaucracy deems this useful in sustaining its power, why not? Can we see this today in what is called woke capitalism, the systematizing and commoditizing of the irrational with a managerial focus on power, not profit? Or in our irrational, unresponsive, unrepresentative governments, prepared to shut down productive aspects of its economy, implement policies that produce entropy, not order, enter into wars that serve no domestic purpose, and even sterilize and culturally obliterate and impoverish its own people for goals that appear esoteric at best, or malicious, or driven by foreign interests at worst? Weber did anticipate that the process of rationalization would lead to disenchantment, or demystification and secularization of the world, placing technology and science at the center of the regime, with religion, myth, and even magic pushed to the sidelines, regarded as irrelevant and unimportant. Even by the early 20th century, Weber could say, humanity has been imprisoned in an iron cage of its own creation. Weber saw that the answer to this despair may be in the periodic rise of charismatic personalities, which one could see as transformative in nature, or perhaps a corrective. He described charismatic authority as the great revolutionary force, and indeed it may be the only counterforce to the inevitability of the capitalistic bureaucratic managerial machine, even as it sputters and declines. But in the time, or perhaps the hindsight of COVID, one has to question whether Weber has significantly underestimated the machine, or whether there is in fact another form of legitimizing authority that he could not anticipate. During COVID, we observed leaders and especially health officers of the state taking on a ever increasingly feminine, motherly quality, speaking slowly in simple sentences, professing love and compassion for the people, while choking back tears and loosening real ones, while suspending all civil liberties, arresting dissidents, fining the defiant, banning and stigmatizing contrary ideas, banning and stigmatizing the very questioning of the state in the name of safety. In our profoundly effeminized world, most of the population around us was utterly defenseless against what should have been obvious, that the assault was blatant, irrational, hypocritical, illogical, and memory-holing of the past. The very recent past was obliterated, as if under a kind of spell or hypnosis, or simply preferring the embrace of the mother as legitimate authority. We will have to dig a bit deeper than Weber into charismatic authority. Is it, as the great English thinker Thomas Carlyle would have understood it, an element of the great man theory of history, or can charismatic authority operate as a rat or snake-like creature, or perhaps even like a virus, entering the body politic and functioning as a kind of autopilot to the machine, adjusting the course of the traditional or bureaucratic forms of authority as they become decadent and clumsy, and before they break down or run aground, and is replaced by personal charismatic leadership, Then, when the bureaucracy is safe, becoming routine again and vanishing from the scene. The machine, with the benefit of the science of persuasion, advanced mind control techniques, applied psychology, propaganda, mind-altering drugs, an addicted population, a depressed population, despair, and by means of invisible forms of coercion, which I will discuss in the next episode, may already have developed an antidote to the coming of the great or charismatic man, the populist dream, in the form of a fourth type of legal authority, the impersonal charismatic. Arguably, that is very much what we see today in politics, philosophy, religion, education, bureaucracy itself, and even woke capitalism, the impersonal charismatic machine in action. It is as if the relentless movement of the legal technocratic bureaucratic state has yet another trick up its sleeve, the irrational state. Rationalization has buried within it a hell-like will to survive. Among its tools is charisma without the man, without the person, without the personal. Or if a man or woman is presented as the great hope, that person is a mere shell, a fake, a company man, a front for the regime. Compare the charisma of a Caesar or an Alexander, Napoleon, and the volumes of quotable quotes alone their genius produced, not to mention their world-altering exploits to these fake leaders. Compare real charismatic leaders with fake ones, like an Obama or a Trump or a Trudeau. Arguably, their quotable quotes couldn't fill a postage stamp. Their achievements are virtually non-existent. They merely serve the regime, make promises they never keep, talk utter nonsense, and withdraw when they're no longer useful. But it may in fact be more accurate to refer to the literal impersonal charismatic. The charisma in the form of slogans, policy, programs, faceless bureaucrats, the caring faces of the state that I mentioned before, the banging of pans for the anonymous nurse heroes can be seen as a form of this kind of charisma, or the strange cult-like mantra in the UK that one must do this or do that for the NHS. In a 2011 article in the London School of Economics by John Broye, entitled Max Weber, Charisma and National Leadership, the author concludes, there is an arbitrary quality to Weber's insistence on just three types of legitimate authority. One can classify Weber's ideal types in terms of combinations from the two paired contrasts of personal/impersonal and routine extraordinary authority. Traditional authority is personal and routine. Legal, rational authority is impersonal and routine. Charismatic authority, as defined by Weber, is personal and extraordinary. This leaves a fourth possibility, impersonal and extraordinary authority. It is not belief in an individual that constitutes charismatic domination, but keeping strictly to Weber's sociology of domination, the existence of a following that is oriented to leadership seen as extraordinary rather than traditional or legal rational. Impersonal charisma would reside in an institution or organization. Such an institution would represent beliefs as ideal interests, but, as Weber insisted constantly, there are an infinite number of such beliefs, just as there are any number of purposes that a state can pursue. It is the sociology of the following that matters. And the author gives the example of Lenin the man, Lenin the person, the charismatic leader, being transformed into an adoration of Lenin the institution. But in any event, whether or not we can identify other types of authority and legitimacy, Weber's three classic types of authority remain extremely helpful as a starting point in understanding legitimacy and authority. Further, whatever the type, all depends on belief or faith. Legal domination depends on the general belief in the legitimacy of the regime. In the case of legal authority, that the Constitution governs the affairs of the state, and that national and state laws actually are controlling the affairs of the people. Whether or not that is true, Weber was undoubtedly right that without a belief in the law's legitimacy, the legal domination would be replaced by chaos and disorder. The same applies to a loss of belief in traditional or charismatic authority. Although there are certainly a lot of bad societies, and some societies better than others, the worst case scenario is a collapse of belief and nothing to replace it. That essentially means the death of the society. A good case can certainly be made that we're in a transitory period, a period where there is a collapse of faith. That may in fact be an explanation for what we observe today, where, for now, a minority, for various reasons, no longer believes in the bureaucratic system, no longer believes it is legitimate or is emanating authority or grace, and increasingly is resistant to domination by what it sees as the illegitimate. And what is seen as illegitimate is the other side's charismatic leadership, not my president, for example. This could present an extraordinarily dangerous and unsettling state of affairs, reflecting a society in transition to one or other of Weber's forms of authority, or a new hybrid, or potentially to nothing. In conclusion, the laws governing human society will depend on belief in the governing authority and on the type of that authority. Further, the foundation of legitimate authority in human society can be rational or irrational, or a combination of the two. Next, we look at law and coercion.
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal.